I have a couple of questions. I will only pose one right now to give others a chance. You started out by differentiating state law and public law. Could you expand on that?
So it's done in private law, I meant.
You meant state law, so public law.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So I just...
Yeah.
Then please allow me to pose one other question of my list here. What exactly do you mean when you refer to power?
Okay. One account I like about power, I mean, we both recognize it's a complex concept, is Stephen Luke's old book on power, it's 1970 something. And he says 3 dimensions, but basically he emphasizes 2 dimensions. One dimension of power is, a gun in my pocket, money of your life, okay? And that's raw power, a threat of violence, threat of something like that. The other one is, I kind of persuade you to be a good idea if you help me with something. And for good or bad reason, I use persuasion. And the more subtle this is, the more subtly the power is exercised. And a lot of management is like that. There's a subtle agenda shifting, selecting priorities, framing things in different ways. Politicians do this with spin. And that's more subtle power, and that's power as we see it most of the time. And that second dimension is just as important as the first, and particularly in times of normalcy. In times of disruption, the other thing, violence, may be important, but normalcy is important.
Isn't it that when we're talking about these 2 kinds of power that you've been referring to, just pure use of physical force versus persuasion, one of the most important characteristics of law is that the use of physical power is monopolized with the state,
yep.
And it's taken out of the hands of the citizens.
Yeah.
Right? So because the state, to enforce its laws, is allowed to use physical power. That's why every policeman is carrying a gun, of course. But in everyday interactions within citizens, that's illegal, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to resort to persuasion and rhetoric, and politics is all about that kind of power, rhetoric, because the use of physical violence has been monopolized by the state. Now, weak states can't do that.
Mm. That's right.
What about the US?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good counterexample that I would say has historical reasons. They haven't been able to really realize that idea as much as Europeans have to because of their history. They had the period of colonization, which was essentially a lawless period when you were moving west. You couldn't rely on the state, right? The reason the monopoly of physical violence developed in Europe, I think, was the war situation.
Yeah.
Because the state was created. One of the most important goals of creating the state was just pacifying the territory after the 30 Years' War. I mean, that's Hobbes, right? Thomas Hobbes. And that may be one of the reasons why the Americans were not so successful in doing that. They didn't have this war situation. They had a completely different situation. They could move west. It was a free country. Everybody went there to have his own farm, his own land, essentially. But it didn't have to fight everybody else, Of course, you needed a weapon. You had some natives, of course, to deal with, and it was essentially all the state. But I think that could be a good historical explanation for that. But still, yeah. I mean, okay.
I would like to come back to your different. You made a remark concerning different kinds of corporations. In Germany, we have the distinction between the corporations proper, we call it Kapitalgesellschaften, and on the other hand, the Personengesellschaften. And the question is, this is not a kind of corporation. It's not a legal person. If you sue such kind of a firm, you actually sue the owner, the entrepreneur himself, and he is liable with all of his all of his wealth.
Yeah.
Does that?
That's also possible I'm not familiar with German law, but it's also possible in Anglo-American law as well. I can be a sole trader, and I can screw up and I can be sued and lose everything. But I can also, sorry?
And you can have partnerships.
And you can have partnerships, that's right. But if I can also convert myself into a corporation, so I don't lose my house when I'm sued. So there's different forms. I mean, and there's partnership, and different kinds of partnership, and there's joint stock and all this. So there's all these complications. So I'm glossing over all those complications. But
basically, these partnerships would also count that as a legal entity, as a firm.
But there's now sort of kind of hybridized partnerships which are limited liability partnerships. So we now have all this spectrum of variants and European standards, and but basically you either have legal incorporation of some form or another, or you have partnerships which are not legally incorporated, but nevertheless are legal entities, and what binds a partnership together is the articles of association between the partners. So the glue question is answered differently. It's not answered by an act of incorporation. It's a contract between the partners. And with a single person, there's no glue because you have one person.
Right. But it's also a legal person that is defined by the ability to hold property, enter contracts, suing and being sued. So the term legal personality is a general term and can be applied to individuals, that would be natürliche Personen, or it could be applied to a firm, then it's a Personengesellschaft. Right?
Yeah, so I like your discussion on this evolutionary, does law emerge? So I never really considered law, but money, and there, within evolutionary theory, you have people say, well, money evolves. And my argument would be the moment that there's a state, it overrules the emergent money, and you have Gresham's law with the bad money driving away the good money. So I see your argument similar within law, that in small societies you may have customs, and as societies evolve and get more complex, you get the state and the law. So corruption could be seen as emerging in this field between custom and law, in societies moving from custom to law, or from one law system to another. So am I being too optimistic saying that this approach would have it, that corruption is something that is there for a period until, because some people will still use custom, and other will find holes in the law, and so.
I think it would be optimistic to say that corruption is easy to get rid of. You know what I'm saying? It's not, and we have corruption problems in developed countries. We have corruption scandals, some of which we see, which are visible, and some which we never hear about. When your allusion to the fact there's a kind of the interaction between custody arrangements and state arrangements often gives rise to corruption is true, because what happens in a custom-based society is quite often the family and kin-based relationships are the basis of enforcement. And that's still true in countries like Greece and in parts of Italy as well, right? So the family becomes the key unit. The family, the key unit, and it's the failure of the state to transcend those arrangements, which means that you rely on family reputation. Just like the Maghreb traders relied on their religious identity, family X, his reputation becomes the important thing. It's the way the mafia works, the ways that other more legal relationships work. So, and the absence of enforcement effective enforcement by other means. And of course, when that clashes with the state machine, when you're meant to be neutral between people, when you're trying to open up trade to people who are not in your family group, and you're relying on favours, then you get corruption. So you get devices where people try and sort of use that family reputation framework and co-opt people into it, and use corruption as a means of doing so. And so it's transcending small-scale reputational effects, which is a key problem in development in many cases. And Greece is a very, very, very important example here.
Following up on that, you said, and that's also basically the title of one of your papers with Young from 2007, corruption being basically the breaking of rules, breaking of legal rules, and other legal and other rules, breaking of legal and other rules. How about, would it be possible to frame it that, because this breaking of rules has a sort of normative notion to it, to me at least, in the sense that it would be good to not break these legal rules.
Mm-hmm.
How about framing it in a way that we say corruption is just following other types of rules? Because it's not that there are no rules at all, it's just that they're not legal rules. And how about we frame it in a way that it's just followed another set?
That's actually how we define it. We say this is a set of rules, and the corruption is when you corrupt those rules, we're breaking them. There's actually good corruption. Okay, good corruption is if Schindler's List, the Schindler case. Schindler bribes Nazi agents so he can save Jews, and that's good cause corruption, moral cause corruption. So you can be corrupt for good reasons. So not all corruption is bad. And this is bad laws particularly. You can get around them by corrupt means for good ends.
But maybe, is there going to Marx, going back to Marx, is there a place in Marx's writing that where does Marx come closest to an ontology of economic relation?
I've asked that question for a long time, and it's kind of hints everywhere, but what it boils down to is a kind of materialist view. Right. As we were talking yesterday, as I was claiming vis-a-vis Marx, eventually it reduces down to a sort of commodity-based material view of money, for example. I think that this is a big problem in Marx. It's a kind of physicalist ontology. I mean, he also talks about relations. That's important. It was stressed yesterday, but there's a relational aspect to Marx, but there's always about stuff going on. So he never really answers the question. I know it's not just him to blame. I think this problem goes back to Smith. Smith's a great economist, but I think he...
With the basic transaction being a barter transaction, having no standard relations.
Yeah.
And then you don't even need an ontology of relation because there's no relation.
Yeah.
It's just bartering all the time.
And Smith invents this idea of capital as stuff. Capital as material stuff.
Right. Basically, Marx doesn't criticize that.
No, he just adopts it. He takes
more
it.
More or less unconsciously, almost.
Yeah, we criticize Smith for assuming what Smith assumes to be talking about is universal for human history,
right.
He does that, which is the historical specificity argument with Marx is right.
Very much so.
Yeah, but he takes on board this classical issue, problem.
Thank you.
If I can just on this, I think it also follows from the fact that for Marx, essentially economics is about the material basis of life.
Yeah.
So everything that has to do with producing, reproducing, consuming the material basis of life.
Stop.
So this, but you see, that is a relevant issue.
Sure.
Right, of course.
Of course it is.
And that was before catalytics came into being, as essentially economics as a science of market transactions, essentially. That was the main definition, so Schumpeter had exactly the same definition when he tried to say what are economic relations, what is economic behavior. It's everything that has to do with this. And for example, Schumpeter that takes into account more the legal elements is also subtly critical of them. And he makes the example of the marriage concept. He makes this marriage example to criticize some aspects of not legal institutionalism, it was not there at the time, but some elements of institutionalist thinking, saying that yes, you can even define marriage as the contract, right? The legal element that is, and you can identify marriage very well through that legal contract. So those who are in that kind of legal contract, they are married, and the others are not. So as a definition, it works perfectly well. But as a conceptualization of what marriage is limited, first and foremost, and probably limited to a less important element. So if we have to explain what marriage is and why marriage is important and what is the consequence of marriage, maybe the legal aspect is not the most important aspect.
So are we basically saying that the legal aspects are very good in the sense of defining issues, but not that much in describing them?
In this case, it is. I don't know how much you can expand it, because I can think of examples where actually the legal aspect is crucial. Like the legal, for the firm, as we see, the legal personality of the firm is crucial, right? So I would not generalize it always, but Schumpeter himself, he was very keen on underlying the legal aspects, but from case to case.
I mean, the problem here is if you've got a heterogeneous set of qualities, right? Statements like this is more important than that depends on some commensurability, and often with qualitatively heterogeneous things, the basis of commensurability is difficult to establish. So we can say that in the day-to-day life, what's important in marriage is not the legal aspect, but it comes to points in a marriage relationship where the legal aspect is important. For example, things like right of care of the children, dealing with debt, dealing with mortgages, the house, the property, all this stuff, it becomes very important. So day to day, there's literature on this. We don't write out contracts about who's going to do what, your job to do the cleaning, etc. And if we did it that way, we'd not only be tedious, it would make the whole thing dysfunctional. So it has to be beyond the law, beyond contract, beyond formality. But nevertheless, the formality is important in some cases. So even in that case, I think it's important. The law, it's in the shadow of the law, basically. And a lot of things function like that because these people like Williamson rightly point out that businesses rarely go to the courts. If they went to the courts all the time, it was just too expensive, it would be tedious. But it's the fact that you can call upon this if necessary. It's over there. It's remote, but it has a presence. It has a relevance. It can be brought in. It can be used as a threat if necessary, a credible threat if you have a case. But we manage without always writing things down and getting co-signatures on it. And we manage by give and take by a lot of the time.
I would like to raise a fairly general question. If once you realize law is really one of the basic defining institutions of capitalism and even Western civilization, going back to Roman law, then pretty soon the question comes up: why does so much of social science completely under-conceptualize this?
Yeah. Good question.
And how did this come about? I mean, lawyers would never, they could never do it. If lawyers would under-conceptualize law the way social scientists do, the whole system wouldn't work anymore, right? So that's a strange thing. And maybe if we use Marx as an example of trying to figure out how that could come about, I think, in that whole phase of state building, when you're actually trying to set up these institutions, that's when you have to think about law, because if you don't, you're not going to get the institutions right. So if we go back in the history of ideas, that's probably where we're going to find those thinkers who were thinking heavily about law. Now, in the case of Germany or Prussia, that's of course that whole phase of German idealism with Kant and Hegel and all of that, and they helped to set up these basic legal institutions by providing the philosophy behind it and legitimating these as being natural and being a good thing. But once that was accomplished, and in Marx's case, he was born in 1818. That was a couple of years after these reforms in Prussia that put in place all these institutions. Once you have them, you don't have to worry about them anymore. You can take them for granted, right? So Marx, he actually started out studying law, and then he went to philosophy, and then he went to discovered Adam Smith and British political economy stuff, and then he said, well, no, that's the German ideology. We don't need that anymore. Germany is behind. The British are ahead of us. They've already industrialized, and we have to look at what they are doing theoretically, and that got him away from that whole law thing. And he didn't have to worry about it because it was established, right? But all these countries who want to establish a system like that, they wouldn't have to look at people who ignore law, but they would have to look at the phase when Europe was trying to build states and use these thinkers as guides rather than, modern economists, neoclassical economists who can just presuppose that being there. And the question is, how can we get social scientists to think about law more if they can still presuppose it here in Europe? What's the need for them? And I think the development question, of course.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and we could spend hours discussing it. I just say some things which I think are important. I think metaphor in science is very important, and I think much of social science is imbued with a physicalist metaphor, particularly in economics. And in classical economics used a particular kind of physical metaphor, and then as Miroski demonstrates, neoclassical economics comes along and uses another kind of physics to base its metaphorical vision on. And we need to fundamentally change the worldview. Marx is not alone in defining economics as about the material conditions of life. Obviously food and water and all these things are important, but other things are important too. Care is important, and interpersonal relationships. We know that these things are important for our mental health, our personal development, and so on. So it's intangible, non-material things are also, relational issues are important. So economics should be about those. So we need an alternative formalism as well. We need instead of having production functions where stuff goes in one end and factors of production, and we turn the handle and stuff becomes out. This is all physicalist. Monetary theory, so standard mainstream monetary theories, is substances, it's numbers which are measuring amounts of money. And the notion that money can be created as if from nothing in financial systems is jars with these models because they have a sort of conservation metaphor, physical conservation metaphor in them. So we need to reconstruct the ontological foundations of the metaphors that we use to understand these phenomena.
Maybe just one clue to answer the question why some economists under conceptualize law. I remember a remark of a colleague. He said, well, we're just thinking differently. Lawyers think about what is the basis of a claim, and economists think in terms of incentives. So that's something simply different. So therefore, it's no need to take into account. We have to, but different way of thinking.